Now it's my pleasure to introduce our speaker, Martin Sorrell. From the World Economic Forum in Davos to Wall Street, Sir Martin Sorrell is one of the world's most celebrated global chief executives. Since founding WPP in 1985, Sir Martin has grown the company into the largest advertising and marketing services group in the world. He has served as its chief executive from the start. WPP companies, which include some of the most preeminent agencies in the business, provide clients with advertising, media investment management, data investment management, public relations and public affairs, branding and identity, healthcare communications, direct digital, promotion and relationship marketing, and specialist communication services. Anything else you do?
That's enough.
Collectively, WPP employs over 170,000 people in over 3,000 offices in 110 countries. The group's worldwide companies include such recognized companies as JWT, Ogilvy & Mather, Advertising, Y&R, Mindshare, Mediacom, Hill & Knowlton Strategies, and WPP Digital. Clients include 350 of the Fortune Global 500, all 30 of the Dow Jones 30, 63 of the NASDAQ 100, and 31 of the Fortune E50. In 2012, WPP had revenues of $16.5 billion and billings of $70.5 billion. Sir Martin comes from humble beginnings, born in London and educated at the independent haberdashers' Aske's Boys' School. He then went on to study economics at Christ's College in Cambridge and obtained his MBA from Harvard University. His early career led him to acquisitions work for Saatchi & Saatchi. Sir Martin then moved on to pursue the idea of assembling a holding company that would provide a full line of marketing services to clients all over the world. In 1985, Sir Martin acquired a small manufacturer of wire shopping baskets, WPP, and over time transformed it into the driving force it is today, a global business that has reshaped the advertising industry. He is a widely respected thought leader, and according to those who have the privilege of working with Sir Martin, he is valued for his innate genius, astute grasp of the nuances of global economies, tireless work ethic, and fierce determination to simply be the very best in the industry. Most impressive, however, is Sir Martin's ability to identify, develop, and manage talent across the globe, including talent in some of the most politically and economically challenged regions. Sir Martin supports the advancement of international business schools, including the Harvard Business School, IESE, the Indian School of Business, and the China-Europe International School of Business. He's been publicly recognized with a number of awards, including the Harvard Business School Alumni Achievement Award, and he received a knighthood from Queen Elizabeth II in January of 2000. In addition, Sir Martin contributes to many important organizations and charities. In 2008, he was appointed by the English Football Association to the board of the bid to stage the 2018 FIFA World Cup. He's on the executive committee of the World Economic Forum International Business Council, a member of the Business Council in the U.S., he's a trustee of the British Museum, a member of the corporate advisory group of the Tate Gallery, and on the International Advisory Board of the Russian Museum in St. Petersburg. Sir Martin also sits on the board of directors for Alpha Topco, the Formula One company, Alcoa, Sorrell Capital, and the Bloomberg Family Foundation. He also serves on the advisory board for Stanhope Capital. And just think, before he does his next speech, his introducer will add, and he has spoken at the Economic Club of Chicago. Please join me in welcoming Sir Martin Sorrell.
Good evening, everybody. Thank you for that very flattering introduction. I should pick up on one thing that John mentioned, which was as I'm in Chicago. One thing he mentioned, which was the World Cup bid by England. And I was on that committee. I think it has to be eradicated from my CV because some of you may know that there were 24 members of FIFA that were going to vote on the candidacy, as opposed to the IOC, which is about 104 members. So it's much tighter. And there were 2 members of FIFA who were banned for voting because of corruption. So there were 22 votes. And in the first round, the English bid won 2 votes, of which one was an English vote. So we only, after 2 years of stress and strain and effort, we only managed to secure 1 vote. So I know how disappointing it is to lose bids. But don't be discouraged. The first ad that you saw about the BBC, the work done by Young and Rubicam in London for the BBC, was a subtle hint that Chicago should bid for the Olympics in 2024. Istanbul may bid again in 2024, and I have to say that we worked with Hassan Arat on the unsuccessful 2020 bid. But there's a serious point here for anybody in this room who's listening or outside the room who may be listening. America, I think, has a very strong chance of winning the Olympic bid in 2024. The competition may be Istanbul, maybe Rome, maybe Kazakhstan, maybe one or two others. But I think what the IOC are looking, and having been in Sochi at the Winter Olympics, which actually has been remarkably successful, despite that might disappoint the Western media who wanted Russia to be under pressure. Particularly, you featured on NBC that little ring, that little snowflake that wouldn't come out as a ring. And they said in Sochi that the ring was that the snowflake was a gay snowflake that didn't want to come out in Sochi. Now, so anyway, I think the IOC is looking for safety, and the reason that Tokyo beat Istanbul, despite the fact that Istanbul would have united West and East, and I think would have been a great testament to Jacques Rogge's presidency or legacy for Jacques Rogge's presidency of the IOC. I do think very seriously that the IOC, with the issues that are facing the Rio Olympics in 2016, with some of the undercurrent about Sochi, although that has been successful, they're looking for safety, and the Tokyo vote indicates that. So I would urge anybody in the room who's involved with the Olympic movement to think about Chicago, or indeed other American cities, but particularly Chicago, for 2024. So enough of that. And we'd be delighted to help anybody in the room or outside it with that bid. So I'm delighted to be here at the Economic Club. I've already used 5 minutes of my 25 to 30 minutes, and I've got a fair bit that I want to go through, but I'm delighted to be here. And when Donald Law, where's Donald, over there, wrote to me and said, come and talk to the Economic Club of Chicago, I thought, wonderful. I had struggled at Cambridge for 3 years with economics. I was not a mathematician. And, I could understand the first half of any article or book, but the mathematics bit, I didn't even do calculus. I couldn't follow the second half. And I was trained, if you can call it trained, or I wrestled with economics with the Keynesian economists of Cambridge. Richard Kahn, Joan Robinson. In my college, a very famous welfare economist called James Mead, Nobel Prize winner, but all very left-wing, which is not my sort of field or part of the field. So I thought Economics Club of Chicago, wonderful. Milton Friedman, all the right-wing monetarists, and I would get. So I was extremely disappointed when I read it has nothing to do with the University of Chicago, with monetarists or right-wing economists, who I've been thirsting for after all these years. It's a business club, but with a very elegant history. And I got your 75th anniversary, and I'm really flattered to be here because you don't invite foreigners. F is for February. Who are the idiots that we can invite? F is for foreigners, all right? Who are the idiots we can invite And I was looking, I mean, the only foreigners I could find in your 75th anniversary document were, well, actually there were two. Tony O'Reilly, ex-chairman and CEO of Heinz, and Tony Blair, former prime minister. The only other foreigner I could find was Werner von Braun. That was the only one, and I think he was probably American by the time that he spoke here. So I'm really flattered to be here, but I know that there was nobody else in the world who was willing to come to Chicago in February. Anyway, so John has very kindly said a little bit about WPP, so I don't have to give you the ad on WPP. You've had it. But for 28 years, I've been CEO of WPP. I started at the age of 40 on my own endeavor, having worked at Saatchi's as CFO to Morris and Charles Saatchi for something like 9 years. And I had this attack of male menopause, which is called andropause, at the age of 40. Today, people live longer, so 40 is not the critical age, but it's probably a little bit older. But at the age of 40, I found that you look back at the first 20 years of your working life, and you were assuming you would retire around 60, and I'm now 69, and I haven't retired yet, although a number of people would like me to retire. So the first 20 years, and you look at the next 20 years, and you think about what you're going to do. And I wanted to start my own company, and we bought into Wire and Plastic Products, and the rest is history. But I want to just sort of dwell on the strategy of WPP, because it's very simple. It may be wrong, but it's very simple. And it really is the background to what I want to talk about, which is about 10 things that we see going on in the world that we think are interesting, that are interesting to our clients, and therefore to us. So let me just start on the strategy. The strategy is one sentence: new markets, new media, data investment management, and last but not least, horizontality. And let me just explain a little bit about each. So new markets are the markets of the world where, despite the current pressure on the fast growth markets, it's the markets that we think are the future. And this is not an easy message to give in the US, or indeed the UK, or France, or Italy, or Spain, or Germany. Because, going back to that criticism of Sochi, the West, to some extent, doesn't want the East to succeed. You see a lot of it in the writings about China, in the Western press and the like. But these new markets, which are already 31% of our business, and which about a dozen years ago probably were 10% or 15%, half that, these new markets are, in my view, still the future. We were talking just over dinner about the last 200 years. Now, China and India have been on the wrong side of history in the last 200 years. But if you go back to the early 19th century, the interesting thing is what Jim O'Neill termed the BRICS and the next 11, so Brazil, Russia, India, and China, and the next 11, actually accounted for 40 to 50% of worldwide GDP, which Jim and Goldman forecast they will again in a few years' time. And CNBC had its 25th anniversary, as you know, this year, and they looked at the world, or they had produced some statistics of what the world would look like in the next 25 years. And in 25 years' time, according to their projection, and I think it was done by Ernst & Young, so it must be right, their projection was China would be the biggest economy in the world at $34 trillion, against $8.5 trillion now. The world is $72 trillion at the moment, so 34. America, the USA, would be 29 trillion, against 16 and a bit currently. And the third economy would be India. And the most populous country in the world would be India with 1.4 billion people, or I think 1.6 billion people, and China would be 1.4 billion. So those new markets, we want to be 40 to 45% of our business. If I have one regret about the last 10 years, is that we haven't gone fast enough. So new markets, new media, digital. What do I mean by digital? I mean certainly classical search, desktop search. I mean display, I mean video, I mean mobile, and I mean social. That's now 35% of our business. Didn't exist, really, 13, 14, 15 years ago. So actually, about half our revenues have changed completely over the last dozen or so years. So new media, again, we want to be 40 to 45%. Data investment management is 25%, so $18 billion of revenue this year. I'm making you all insiders on our results when we announce them next week. $18 billion of revenue. About $4 billion of that is in what we call data investment management, and it's a real business. It's $4.5 billion of investment that our clients make. We used to call it market research or consumer insight. We now call it data investment management. And I have to say, ever since we started to call it data investment management, the revenues have grown faster. When we called it market research or consumer insight, it didn't seem to make any difference. But quantitative disciplines in our business, which is not what Don Draper would have recognized in Mad Men, quantitative disciplines actually account for about half of our business. So we are very much in the era of Mad Men and Maths Men. We very much are working with clients at the CMO and CIO, Chief Information Officer, CTO, Chief Technology Officer level. And the last part of the strategy is horizontality. And what that means is we have 175,000 people in 110 countries. We really effectively have about 15 business verticals, getting them to work together to the benefit of clients. Because I know there are a lot of clients on the podium, in the room, and outside the room. My view, and some of my colleagues don't share this view, my view is that clients want the best people working on their business. And they want them increasingly working in a more effective, that's better, and more efficient means lower cost way. Because the world is basically a difficult place at the moment. So that's the strategy. New markets, new media, data investment management, and horizontality. And I should just say a little bit about how we see the world currently. So if I was making this speech last February, I would have said 4 gray swans. Gray swans are known unknowns. Black swans are unknown unknowns, after Taleb's book. And the 4 gray swans then were Eurozone, Middle East crisis, BRICS hard soft landing, was China going to fall out of bed, or India or Brazil or Russia, the US, deficit, sequester, debt ceiling, all the issues. Those were the 4. Now, today, I think all 4, those grey swans, have probably got a little bit whiter. Eurozone is certainly, with Draghi and Carney, or Draghi in particular, the Eurozone has settled down. It's still not perfect. Western Europe is not recovering as fast as many people would have you believe, or as it is. The bookends of Europe are doing well. Germany and the UK are stronger. The heartland of Europe, continental Europe, if you think of a U-shape, France is still on the downturn in our experience. Italy is probably bumping along the bottom, and Renzi's, the change of government in Italy is very interesting, because I think Renzi's timing is almost perfect, because we see Italy sort of bumping along the bottom and northern Italy actually starting to improve with the German influence, and Spain recovering. But Spain is recovering with unacceptably high levels of unemployment. You can't have 50% of the youth out of work and have social unity. That has to change. And so Europe, I think, is better than it was. Middle East is better. Some Iranian rapprochement, perhaps. Obviously, Syria is still a disaster. Issues around Libya. Maybe the new Egyptian regime will bring more stability after the election. We'll see, but still some challenges. But I think basically, I called it BRICS and the next 11. It's the first time that we can actually talk about the next 11. Because Iran was included by Jim O'Neill in the next 11, and you had to exclude Iran for the obvious reasons. We are starting to see, and at Davos, I think a few people in the room were in Davos, you had Rouhani there, actually, and he did an extremely good communications job. There's a lot of cynicism, particularly in the West, about how genuine Iran is in terms of its initiatives or discussions, but we will see. But I think generally the atmosphere is a little bit better, and there's some very interesting things going on in other parts of the world. Myanmar, even, dare I say it, in Cuba. I think you might see very soon some changes there. Obviously, there's some big challenges in Argentina and Venezuela in particular at the moment, but generally, I would say some of the fractious parts of the world better. BRICS hard soft landing, I'm very bullish on China. It's our third biggest business. We have 1.5 billion revenues. We have 16,000 people there. I think the new regime is very strong. Xi's first speech, unscripted, virtually unprecedented for any Chinese premier to not have a script in front of him. And when he was introduced with the other three members of the new members of the Politburo, the first words out of his mouth was about dealing with corruption. And if you read the 12th five-year plan, which is the previous regime's plan, and the plenum document, which is a model of planning and thinking, and by the way, the Chinese do listen and learn, and they do implement extremely effectively. If you look at this stuff, you can't help but, in my mind, be impressed by what they're doing. Now, there are some problems in the BRICS. You know, Russia, I'm bullish on, but India and India and Brazil are going through some difficulties. We have elections in both countries, and that often causes some issues. But generally, BRICS and Next 11, probably BRICS, not a hard landing, probably a soft landing. And lastly, the US, maybe they've kicked the can down the road sufficiently far to establish a little bit of more confidence. And the US, I think, is in a fascinatingly positive position. There's a document that's done by a division or a part of the CIA every time a president is elected or re-elected, which is, I think, publicly available. And if you studied the document that was produced when President Obama was re-elected, it said that, and the question that report asks is, what will America look like in 20 years' time? And there were the two major conclusions were that America would be energy self-sufficient, so Saudi Arabia would be China's problem and India's problem in 20 years, not America's. And secondly, that there were changes in manufacturing technology that would make America, which is a high labor cost country, much more effective. Because capital inputs will become much more important rather than labor inputs. And if you look at 3D printing, for example, and if any of you haven't looked at the technology, you really should, you will be stupefied by some of the things that may be able to be produced, reducing inputs of labor. That raises big issues about employment, but it certainly makes the high-priced manufacturing countries much more effective and much more efficient and much more competitive. So America, I think, is a very interesting place in the long term. So that's a little bit of the background. The fifth gray swan that had just emerged in Davos was the fractious debate over the islands between China and Japan. And I came away from Davos a few weeks ago actually very seriously concerned about that, because both governments, Prime Minister Abe was at Davos. The Chinese president and premier were not there, but both made it quite clear that they would resort to military action, limited military action is what, I don't know what limited military action actually means, but both of them would resort to military action over the islands. So I would say, I would add that my fifth gray swan, and that was probably the most worrying one. So political risk has actually sort of raised its ugly head a little bit in the context of Davos this year. So that's a little bit of the background. Let me just turn very quickly in the last 10 or so minutes to 10 things that we see going on. The first is the shift in economic power, which I think we generally feel uncomfortable about in the West. Not just to the east, not just to China and India, but to the south, to Latin America, and to the southeast, to Africa and the Middle East. These are fundamental shifts in economic power which, as I say, are uncomfortable, but I think are inexorable. And we've certainly seen our clients trying to take advantage of it, although currency weakness at the moment and a slowing down of growth in these fast growth markets has troubled many people, and you've seen earnings reductions by many companies in the reporting season just recently. The second point is in that most industries, we still see significant overcapacity in terms of production. Our biggest client is Ford Motor Company. It operates still in a market where 80 million units can be produced, and consumers only consume 60 million units. Remember also that the American car market went from 17, 18 million units to 9. It's back up, I think, now to 16, or the projection is 16. The Chinese market is now 21, 22 million units. In fact, 75% of the growth in the car market last year came from China. So when we say maybe China shouldn't be quite so successful, watch out for what you wish for, because that drives the world economy. But basic point is, you still have, despite Lehman and the fact that 2 of the big 3 had to go to the government for money in Detroit, not Ford, but GM and Chrysler, you still have significant overcapacity. Why? Because capacity might have been constricted in the US, but outside America, you had additions from Japan, from South Korea, from China, and that expanded the supply. So the business that we're in, advertising and marketing, differentiation business, becomes more and more important. The shortage is in people. If you look at, this is the irony about this, the paradox, whilst the productive capacity is increased, the number of people available, if you think there's a talent war now, stand by. Because if you look at the demographics of all countries, without exception, even young countries like Mexico, at some point in time, the aging issue becomes a serious issue, particularly with the elongation of life with medical improvements. Third thing is the rise of the web. I don't have to say any more than what you see this morning with WhatsApp. We were talking about that over dinner. $19 billion for a company that's been in existence, what, 5 years? Was it 50 people? Quite extraordinary. But the facts are, the web disintermediates legacy business. It disintermediates it with a different business model. Look at the valuations for WhatsApp and other transactions. And last but not least, looping back to the talent point, young people prefer to work in small, entrepreneurial, technologically driven, networked companies rather than big monoliths and big bureaucracies. Fourth point is the growth of retail power. Really interesting that over the last 20 or 30 years, big retailers have become more and more powerful and important. Walmart, Tesco, Carrefour. That has put pressure on the manufacturers, who've had very little pricing power because of low inflation, and that squeezed their margins because commodity prices have increased, and that's put pressure on the supply chain of which we're part. But the interesting thing is that is probably changing now. The rise of Amazon and Amazon lookalikes, Alibaba in China and the like, is changing the balance of power, I think, between manufacturers and retailers, and giving manufacturers, for the first time, the way of reaching over the heads of retailers, direct to consumers, and establishing direct relationships. The fifth point is the importance of internal communications. I'm sure nobody in this room suffers this problem. We at WPP do. It is, how do we get everybody inside the company to understand the strategic direction of the company and the structure necessary to achieve it. Unfortunately, and as I say, it doesn't apply to anybody in this room, but outside this room, the issue that bedevils most of our clients, and indeed ourselves, is the unwillingness of the silos and the verticals to work together, particularly at the senior reaches of companies. You know, turf territory ego in our industry is quite strong, and there's an inability or unwillingness of people to work together. And the better the people, the worse it is. Good people, the best people, are not cooperative by nature. It's a dangerous thing to say, because if you say that to people, to average people, they think that to be good, you have to be uncooperative. So you defeat your purpose. But internal communications, explaining strategic and structural change, is a critical issue. Global and local structures is the next issue that we see. In the last 6 months, I find this fascinating, you might not, but I do. 3 major clients of ours have slimmed down their center, taken out their regional, or in the process of taking out their regional management and focusing on the countries. So Brazil, instead of being part of Latin America, is direct report. Same with Russia in the context of Europe. Same with India in the context of Asia and China in the context of Asia. And that is starting to focus companies on the center, slimmer, more nimble center, and local. And we're doing that at WPP. We have client leaders, 43 of them that manage clients globally across the whole of WPP, so horizontal across the verticals, and at the country level. We're going back to a country management structure which stimulates people to work together. Next point is the power of finance and procurement. Since Lehman in 2008, finance and procurement, in my view, and you know where I'm coming from, has become too powerful. And clients are very conservative. Average life of a CEO, statistically, probably is 3 to 5 years. Average life of a CMO in America is about 2 years. In that sort of environment, people are unwilling to take risk. Why is it that companies are sitting on $4.2 trillion of net cash? Why is it the buybacks are more popular than acquisitions or growth in dividends? Boards, since Lehman in particular, since that terrible weekend in September of 2008, are terrified of making mistakes. CEOs are terrified of making mistakes. And the way they get to their numbers, particularly currently, is by cutting cost, not by expanding the top line. GDP growth is sub-trend, sub-pre-Lehman, and therefore people don't see enough growth. So finance and procurement has become, in my view, and I would say this, wouldn't I, too powerful. We've, to some extent, lost the art of looking at the top line and investing in brands for growth. And allied to that is the growth of government. And government is here to stay. If you look at the precedent of the 1929 depression, government stayed as an investor, regulator, intervener for many, many years. And in most countries we operate in, our biggest client actually is the government, particularly the year before an election. You often see that. So government is here to stay, and I would urge everybody to think about it. We're forming teams that work with governments in many countries. And the last 2 points, you'll be delighted to know, is the first is, and I should have put this further up the agenda, is the acceptance of social responsibility in corporate strategy. Now, it would have been true 10 years ago or 5 years ago, there was a lot of greenwashing going on. That is no longer the case. In every company that we work with, CSR, I don't like that phrase, but let's call it social responsibility, is at the center of strategic purpose. They've accepted, and we were talking about BP, they've accepted what John Brown said in 1997 at Stanford Business School, which was then really controversial. He said, if you are in the business of building a business for the long term, that was the critical qualifier, long term, you will not do things that destroy the environment. You will not do things that upset NGOs or governments or other stakeholders. It's, you know, we overcomplicate this issue. It's long-term profitability is preserved and developed and grows if you invest in the social responsibility area. And the final issue, which I'm sure is on everybody's mind in our industry, is industry consolidation. I mean, no doubt in the questions that John will give me that might come up, perhaps. But in my view, it's inevitable you will see further consolidation of clients, of media owners, look at what's happening in the cable industry, and last but not least, our own industry. And there's one little final point in relation to this which I think is very important. There is a new strain of investor that is investing in what I would call private equity, family-driven private equity, private wealth-driven private equity. You see it with Warren Buffett and Jorge Lehman and the 3G guys with Heinz. You see it with the Benkiza family, DC Masters, and the coffee business. You see it in a number of other areas where very wealthy families who take a much longer term view than traditional private equity, align with exceptional management like a Lehman and 3G, and take over utilities, tomato ketchup and baked beans, borrow money on the 30-year market at very low rates. WPP went into the bond market last year and we borrowed just over 5% for 30 years. I can assure you the 30-year bond market, as John I'm sure will agree, was not created for advertising agencies. It was created for energy companies, infrastructure companies, but we borrowed at just over 5, which means net after tax 3, we can buy companies at 33 times earnings without feeling the pinch, even though we wouldn't do that. But it's just, so if anybody in the room is getting any fancy ideas about pricing, forget it. So I just point out that these strains of private wealth plus long-term financing, it's very interesting. And I think the packaged goods industry is going to face some interesting issues in the next 12 to 24 months as a result. Thank you very much.
So I have some questions. Were we going to have chairs or sit at? Coming up. Okay, you get to stand up again. You were asking about that earlier.
Okay,
yeah.
Fine.
And then you can sit.
Okay, very good. Pull this round. It's all been stage managed, this. The bits of plaster on the floor. Oh, great, thank you.
Okay.
Good.
So it was a good talk. I enjoyed it. One of the things you mentioned was both your strategy in new media, and then you mentioned Facebook's acquisition of WhatsApp for $19 billion. 5-year-old company, 55 employees, so that works out to be about $350 million per employee. If you were valued similarly with your 170,000,
yes, it would be a lot.
59 trillion. Thoughts on that?
Well, a journalist asked me this morning, and I started off by saying, it sounds potty to me. And I don't know whether anybody understands what potty means, but then, you have to say, Mark Zuckerberg's no fool. He has an exceptional track record, unique track record. So, how can one criticize it until you see the results? It might say interestingly a little bit about what he or his colleagues feel about the Facebook share price. It might be something to do with, I always remember reading the S1 that Mark wrote, where he basically said he was in business to create the greatest social network in the world, not in business from a profitability point of view. I mean, it's an interesting debate of whether one would follow from the other. And it may be that his objectives and philosophy and strategy is different to other people. I do think that the valuation is extraordinary, and to the point of what the journalist was interested in, it will affect valuations not only in technology, but in our industry too. People who are sitting on similar companies will take, it's what I said about the web. You get disintermediated by a different business model, which is based on different variables. It's not about profit, it's not about margins, it's about top line sort of penetration in a sense, in terms of number of hits or number of users and the like. So for a 69-year-old like me, it's very difficult for me to get my mind around that. And would I commit WPP? The nearest we've got to that at WPP was when we bought 24/7 Real Media from David Moore for $600 million, which interestingly was the same relative value.
That was more than the 33 times earnings you were saying you wouldn't.
It wasn't infinite, but it was more than 33 times earnings. And it was the same relative value as Google to DoubleClick and Microsoft to Avenue A. And we bought what we call the poor man's DoubleClick, which David was not very happy about. But we overpaid for the company, and I will continue to tell that to David. But it sowed the seeds for Xaxis, which is our online media planning and buying platform, where we buy inventory, online premium inventory. And it sowed the seed for a lot of our technological development. So that investment, which looked highly priced at the time, has Xaxis on its own. If you look at the values of Criteo and Rocket Fuel, Xaxis on its own, which is inside WPP, is worth $4.5 billion, and we paid $600 million for it. So actually, some of these bets, if I can call them bets, may turn out to say maybe Mark Zuckerberg's 19 billion will be chump change.
Okay, we'll see. Turning to the sort of traditional advertising industry and maybe its future, people have said that the traditional ad model isn't working. You've said that marketing's in a state of anarchy. I guess, what do you mean by that? And given that, how do you conduct business in that environment?
I don't know whether I said marketing's in anarchy. It's a very tough environment. I mean, we had a record, again, making you insiders, we had a record year last year. So we had the crushing year of 2009 after Lehman, and we didn't adjust our business rapidly enough. We adjusted it in 10, got back to beyond where we were in 11 and had a record year in 12 and record year in 13. But I've got to say that it's kicking and clawing your way through. It's not easy. And the slowdown of the fast growth markets, the foreign exchange pressure is colossal. I mean, the pound is at 166, 167 to the dollar. It's extremely strong, I think too strong. I think the dollar, we'll see a resurgence of the dollar. The dollar will get stronger, which will certainly help us because we report in sterling. But it's a very difficult environment. And I come back to Lehman. I think people underestimate the impact of Lehman. They talk about it in the context of consumer thinking. I don't think that's right. I mean, obviously, people have become more concerned about value and the price-value equation, price-quality equation. But at the same time, I think that the biggest, more serious impact was on corporates. Because if you read Andrew Ross Sorkin's Too Big to Fail, several companies were on the verge of bankruptcy. It was denied by GE subsequently. But in the book, it says that Jeff Immelt said that they were 48 hours away from being unable to refinance GE Capital's corporate commitments, which I think was 40 or 50% of GE's profits or capital at that particular point in time. Warren Buffett called it America's financial Pearl Harbor. Going through that has changed, I think, corporate thinking dramatically. And the growth rates that we have subsequent to that are still sub-trend. So GDP this year might grow nominal terms 5.5%, real terms 3.5%, 4%. And this is sub-previous trends. So companies are very cautious about what they're doing, and this makes it very tough. And the rise of finance and procurement, of the FTSE 100, so we're number 30 in the FTSE 100, which is the top 100 companies in the UK, based in the UK by market cap. 50% of the CEOs of the FTSE 100 are ex-CFOs. I'm an ex-CFO, and I would be included in that 50%, but 50% are. So the attitude is very much focused on cost rather than growing revenues. And as one of my colleagues, Jeremy Bullmore, who used to be chairman of JWT in London, has said, there's a limit to what you can do in cost, but there's no limit, at least until you get to 100% market share, to what you can do on the top line. And we've lost sight of that. So I think when you refer to anarchy, if I did say anything like that, which I don't think I have, but words to that effect, it's about how tough it is in this environment where growth is limited.
Right, so given that and how tough it is, how does that affect, I guess, the advertising and marketing services, and how does that, what changes is that going to portend in the industry?
Well, I think our two principal competitors, Omnicom and Publicis, to stir it up a bit, panicked a bit. I mean, nobody would have bet. I mean, I said it was a very bold, brave, and surprising move. I got an email from Bloomberg, I think it was 7 days before the leak on Bloomberg, saying that 2 of your competitors are going to merge and one of them is not IPG. So I immediately sent the email to Maurice Levy and John Wren saying congratulations, to which I got no answer. A few days later, another Bloomberg journalist said, Maurice is going to be chairman and John Wren is going to be CEO. So I sent the same memo on to both of them, and I said, if that's the case, can I be CFO? Again, no answer, and in about 48 hours, the deal leaked. My own view is that they probably took, we sort of sit and wonder why it is that they did it, and it's a transaction, they call it a merger of equals. Now, everybody in this room knows there is no such thing as a merger of equals. There may be mergers of unequals, or if there are mergers of equals, they never work. If anybody can tell me one merger of equals that has ever worked, I'd love to know it. So structurally, it's very challenging. So why do people do this? And I think it's partly to do with what we're talking about, that the pressures in the business are so intense on clients and then on ourselves that, in a chill wind, people will huddle together. And I think that's part of what's going on. And we see that with media owners, and we see that with clients too.
So you've got consolidation going on in kind of your traditional industry space, obviously, which you've talked about.
Yeah.
At the same time, you're facing competition from the Googles of the world, or the McKinseys, or the Accentures, or traditional, non-traditional competitors. When you look out at the landscape in 3 to 5 years, how does that sort itself out? And in that environment, how does WPP sort of establish itself, and what do you do different?
Well, frenemies inhabit every industry. I mean, I always remember, Samsung and Sony compete very heavily, and yet one supplies chips to the other. So we have this, and let's say 5 years ago, or 6 or 7 years ago, when I used the word frenemy in relation to Google, let's look at what's happened since. Our media book is $75 billion. Our biggest media relationship, apart from News Corp and 21st Century Fox, is now Google. We invest $2.5 billion. There's the guy here from Google who told me that we've finalized our sort of upfront deal with them today. And we were very forthright. Our competitors said they're going to be partners. By the way, Publicis and Omnicom now say that one of the reasons they got together was to compete against Google. So, the devil quotes scripture to his or her own purpose. But we said, frenemy. The Google people, and I'm not doing it just to flatter the gentlemen in this room from Google, are superb. I mean, they've lost a lot of talent, but it is amazing how strong their people are. They plan their business exceptionally well. We work with them on an annual basis to targets. We targeted $2.5 billion last year, and we've done $2.5 billion. We're targeting over $3 billion this year, which I think we will achieve. And what's happened is we've developed a strong working relationship in all the 5 areas I mentioned, from display to mobile. And I think Google is in a really strong position, and their strategy, when we had our annual strategy session 2 years ago, we did it in Silicon Valley. We went to the Hacker Square, we went to the Googleplex, and Google wheeled out some of their key people, and they explained their strategy of intelligent search. And what happens with intelligent search, every time we search on Google, we make them more intelligent. So ultimately, it's a self-reinforcing process, and I think Google is in an immensely strong position. I mean, despite Facebook doing WhatsApp, the 2 companies I think that have the strongest positions are Google and Amazon. That doesn't mean that Facebook's not going to be successful, or Twitter, or Instagram, or whatever it happens to be, or Snapchat. But what it means is that we see the great. So the answer to your question is that we've got together with them. And we have to face the fact. I mean, we have nice conversations with Nikesh Arora, with Larry Page, with Eric Schmidt, with Sergey Brin. But when I talk to our people, if I go to India, they tell me that Google's going direct to our clients and trying to eat our lunch. I think you have to accept in many industries, in fact, I would say all industries, that there will be frenemies, and you have to develop relationships and meaningful relationships with your clients. But I would say those threats that you're inferring there are, if you work at it, you can build very considerable bridges that will work to both sides' advantage. But I wouldn't underestimate the power of Google, and I wouldn't underestimate the power of Amazon. I think that's another fundamental, and I touched on it. Online retailing is changing the balance of power between retail and manufacturers. Manufacturers who've been on the back foot for the last 20 years, I think, have the opportunity to get more on the front foot in that head-to-head, because people don't talk about this very much, but it is a friction relationship.
Let's talk about big data for a moment, and how you use it, I guess.
We don't talk about big data. We actually have a big data business.
Right. So
others talk about third-party data.
So how do you use it? I mean, so what is it? How should we think about it? How do you use it?
Well, the answer is, for us, it's with great difficulty. So we called it data investment management, which is the same phrase we use for media planning and buying. We call it media investment management. And the reason that we've done that is because I really do think we have a massive opportunity to leverage the knowledge that we have in data investment management in our media planning and buying. I mean, the engine of WPP, and this doesn't resonate well with Don Draper or their latter-day equivalents. But the engine of WPP, the engine of POG, I would argue, is the media side of the business. And again, it's a very controversial thing to say, which many of our people don't like me saying, but I'll say it again. The medium may have become more important than the message. That the medium may control or direct the message. Whereas in the old days, you craft the creative on a good strategic platform, and you craft the creative and then drive it through the distribution channels. It may be that you have to have different planning and different creative for the multiplicity of media. And if I just think about the numbers for a minute. We have 75 billion our media book is 75 billion. Our revenues are 18 billion. The real strength of the companies, and POG will be even bigger in terms of billings, the real strength, combined billings, the real strength, I think, of these businesses is determined by media. And in most markets, we have a 25, 30, 40% share of media market, which gives us a great ability to work on behalf of our clients with media owners, both legacy and new. And I think that's really the interesting part of it. So using data for that part of the business is critically important. Now, we don't do it as well as we should do, but we have a massive opportunity to do it because POG doesn't have a data business. They mouth about it, but they don't have it. They say they buy third-party data. We actually have it. What we haven't done yet, to your point, is leverage it as effectively as we should.
So as you do that and leverage it more, will that change the value of creative in your company? Traditionally, we think of ad agencies as storytellers. Yeah. Will it?
Yeah, but we narrowly define creative. So Don Draper wouldn't recognize 3/4 of our business today. So, 4 billion in media, 4 billion in data investment management, 6 billion in digital. So that's 14 out of 18, which didn't exist in the 60s. But that doesn't mean, I always find the attitude of, again, this gets me into hot water, but the traditional creative attitude in the UK is that, you know, a lot of this new stuff is not creative. I mean, creativity exists in many different forms, in many different functions. Even financial directors can be creative. Sometimes they are too creative. But this idea that creativity is just in the realm of a traditional creative department is, in my view, arrogant, opinionated, and wrong. Because the digital creativity we see, media creativity we see, data creativity. You know, there's going to be a category at Cannes this year, for the Cannes Lions Awards, of data visualization. You know, how can you present data in a creative way? How can governments present data? How can businesses internally and externally present data in a meaningful way? I mean, creativity is very broad and very varied, and I just think we as an industry have been too hidebound by tradition and haven't thought about it in a more open way. So I think data and unifying media and data and digital is very powerful. And, you know, I don't have to Google, Twitter. You know, we have an arrangement with Twitter now where we link our television measurement data with Twitter usage. We've launched this in the UK and in Italy. Nielsen have launched it here in the US. We're going to launch it in more countries where we do television audience measurement. We do it in about 30, 40 countries around the world. We'll launch more and more with Twitter on that. But you show the power of TV, of live television in particular, by showing how consumers engage through, in this case, Twitter, with those programs.
So with all that data in your data management business and just the general increased tracking, privacy concerns, I mean, how do you view privacy? And obviously you're getting some backlash, you know, particularly in Western Europe, to the concept of...
You know, if I went back 6 or 7 years ago, we went to Brussels to see Neelie Kroes, who was the Director General who's really concerned about the privacy issue, with the Interactive Advertising Bureau to argue for opt-out. There's no way we could win that battle today. Everything has to be opt-in. You know, everything we've done with Xaxis has been on an opt-in basis with clients. You have to secure people's permission, and they have to understand how you're going to use the data and what you're going to use the data for. And there are two issues. It's not just privacy, it's security. Because people mix these two issues. NSA and Snowden raises the issue of privacy, but they also, you know, the hacking stuff that goes on also raises the issue of security. And what consumers, I think, are really concerned about is how secure their information is, as well as the issue about how it gets used. What we have to do is to develop, as an industry, is develop an effective opt-in policy. So instead of going to a website and getting a 16-page closely typed document that you get fed up and you just say, I agree and I accept, you have to have some simple way of telling consumers what they're letting themselves in for. This is very important. And to your point in the previous question, one of the problems we've had on big data, where we've said to clients, look, let's just put together all the sources of data that we provide you with and others provide you with onto a real-time dashboard, the legal departments get very concerned about it. And they say we have to be very careful about how we use even the data that we have now in more meaningful and integrated ways. So it's a very, very touchy area. And the NSA and Snowden examples and some of the hacker invasions that we've seen make it a very difficult issue to deal with.
Mm-hmm. So one more question on kind of traditional advertising, particularly in the new media world, where where the platforms shift, and when we take stuff on mobile, we're not taking it on television anymore. We're taking it on mobile, any kind of device, wherever, whenever. We do time shifting attendant to it. How do you relate your advertising to that in a world where people are not watching the ad because they're bypassing it on the device they're watching, or they're time shifting, so the ad may not be relevant when they're watching it?
Yeah. Well, we have to find more targeted ways, more creative ways of doing it. But I think there are two fundamental shifts that are going to take place, that have still to take place. So Mary Meeker and we have done some data, or put together some data which shows how consumers spend their time with media and where we invest the money. So that 75 billion I mentioned, or the industry as a whole, it's $1 trillion industry. Where do we invest the trillion, or the 500 billion that is spent on traditional media as opposed to the 500 billion that's spent on other things like research and things? So where does it get spent? And there are two big discontinuities. The first is on newspapers and magazines. The industry invests about 20% of that 500 billion on magazines and newspapers. We know that consumers only spend 10% of the time. This is US data, 10% of the time on them. That's one thing. The other thing is we know that consumers spend about a third of their time on mobile and the internet. And we know that we are only investing as an industry 20% of that 500 billion on internet and mobile. Those two things have to change. And they will change because, just remember one thing, the class that's graduating now, or is just graduated from American universities, is the first generation that's lived with the internet from the day they popped their head out of the womb. And that when these people get into positions of influence and power and authority, it will change. There'll be a Moore's law of acceptance. So 35% of our business is in digital. Why? Against a 20% weighting for the industry and a 1/3 for consumer usage. Well, we want to be where consumers are, but also we want to get it to 40 to 45. Why? Because we think the take-up is going to be stronger. So those two things, TV is about right, outdoor is about right, radio is about right, although there are some shifts that are going to take place. But the two principal things are newspapers and magazines and internet and mobile.
Okay, we're running near the end of our time, so let me switch to a couple of personal questions.
Yeah.
One relates to the media. When you wake up in the morning, what do you first look at, read, and what kind of device do you read it on?
Gosh, you're going to get me into real trouble. So I get my iPad and I download the latest Wall Street Journal, Financial Times, New York Times, London Times, New York Times, etc., and I flip through those. But I don't read the newspapers in their electronic form like I used to read the physical newspaper. I watch when I'm in New York, so I spend about a third of my time in London, a third of the time in New York, and the other third in the air, basically. When I wake up in London, I watch CNBC Squawk Box as well. When I wake up in New York, I watch CNBC Squawk Box. When I go to bed at night, I watch Newsnight with Jeremy Paxman, if anybody knows who BBC Newsnight. And I actually watch a lot of Charlie Rose, actually, before I nod off in the evenings. And then I stream during the day Bloomberg in my office. So I have that on continuously. So, but my habits have changed. Interestingly, certainly from my point of view, I don't read Fortune, The Economist, The Investor's Chronicle like I used to. I used to read those things religiously, from not every page, but I would look for the headlines and then I'd read what I was interested in. But I don't do that like I used to, and I don't even do it with, in the way that I used to do it with physical newspapers. Just one little story. So I remember I was watching Charlie Rose, and the media correspondent in the New York Times was being interviewed by Charlie Rose, and he asked him exactly the same question. What do you do? Where do you get your information when you wake up in the morning? So this is a guy from the New York Times, and he says, Twitter. And I couldn't believe it. Do
you have a favorite ad campaign?
No, I'm not allowed to say that because that would so upset
all of your other children.
Yeah. Well, I do have one which I publicly admitted to, which I wish I could show you, which was done by a Norwegian agency of ours for a language school. And it had a Germanic intern on the sonar analysis or the rescue analysis, and somebody is shouting out, Mayday, Mayday, we are sinking. And the guy who's on the screen says, "What are you thinking about?" It'll sink in a minute. It's much better in the film.
So one final question. Chicago is a global city, and yet
Yes.
we're stuck between two of the coasts here. Visitors often come in
Yeah.
and remark, I had no idea what a beautiful city it is. What advice do you have for us in terms of branding our city other than hiring WPP?
Well, we have, I've got sitting on the desk there, a very, very good analysis we have two brand measurement tools, one called Brand Z, which is Mill Brown, which is based in Naperville. They're Brand Z, and then we have Brand Asset Valuator, which is a Young and Rubicam valuation tool. And I could bore you by reading the whole of it, but I won't. But other than to say this, that when we look at brands, the BAV analysis shows that the qualities that you would attribute to Chicago, trustworthiness, dependency, hard work, not too flashy, not superficial, those qualities actually have become much more important in branding products and services in the last few years, particularly, I would argue, post-Lehman. So what Chicago represents, or what we think Chicago as a city represents, actually has become more pertinent and more relevant recently in terms of image and perception. And I shall come back to where I started. One of the ways of changing or stimulating the images of nation states or city-states or cities is there are probably three events that can change perception. I mean, I would argue Beijing's perception was changed by the Beijing Olympics, that South Africa's was changed by the World Cup. Now, despite the controversy about Brazil and Rio in 2016, they will be great tournaments and great Olympics. Sochi has been more successful than many people wanted it to be. Whatever the rights and wrongs of investing $50 billion are, it will be, I think, regarded as a more successful event. So I would argue that Chicago has values and virtues that should be merchandised, if I can put it as crudely as that. One of the ways of doing that is through an Olympic Games. And so I finish where I started. Another one would be the World Cup, and another one would be Formula One. Those are the three sort of, I think, image-changing events. And if you look at cities that are trying to break in, or states that are trying to break in, or countries trying to, they do go for those type of things. So I would argue that Chicago's virtues and strengths, its strong shoulders, are virtues that are very relevant today, and they have to be stimulated and merchandised. And one of the ways I would encourage that is by a bid for 2024.
So Martin, thank you very much. We appreciate your being here. So we are adjourned.